General, it's hard to know where to start, but maybe we could just start with the span of your career. Because when you went to West Point, we were still in Vietnam, 1972. And that was a pretty bad time for the US military. And you wrote in your book about how cadets felt that they were estranged from the general society in which they lived, that what they did wasn't really respected. Fast forward for me, if you would, from then to now, almost 42 years now. How has that changed? And why has it changed?
It's changed more fundamentally than even we realized. When I first got to West Point, it was the summer of 1972. And the class of 76, which I was in, that entered that year, statistically had the easiest time of being admitted to West Point of any class in its history because it just wasn't that popular, and that's how I got in. But I remember we got to West Point, and the Army had been buffeted by things from Vietnam, the My Lai massacre, a number of other things were still ongoing. There was really a crisis in confidence in the Army, and of course the nation was going through quite a bit. But you're a little bit protected from that at West Point. You get in there, and it's a cloistered environment. But after about 4 or 5 months, you get to go out for your first time for a few hours, and we went down to a football game. And then after that, we had like 2 hours in New York City. And I remember we got off this bus, and we had to wear our gray full-dress uniforms. And you don't think of yourself as different, but you get out, and you're sort of looking like the guards from The Wizard of Oz. And a car drives by, and a young girl sticks herself out almost to the waist, leaning out of the back window, and flips us off. And you don't know her, and but you suddenly realize that there's this feeling about who you now are that you don't feel like you're being a part of, but suddenly there was that depth of doubt and question. Now, as we went forward, the first few years of my career, the Army was still sort of sorting its way out. I went to the 82nd Airborne, and it was really in bad shape in the late 70s. But then things started to get much better, late 70s, early 80s. And then suddenly the Army changed sort of with society. And the Army, we went from having to beg people to re-enlist in the Army in my first tour to, in the early 1980s, we did these boards to see if we would allow them to stay in the Army. And so suddenly the Army got more professional. Society started having a different view of the military, and by the end of the 1980s, suddenly it had changed dramatically. How we were treated, how we thought of ourselves, great confidence. Probably the apogee of that was the first Gulf War. And it has been through this entire last more than a decade of war where the military has had a very difficult time, as you can imagine, asked a lot. It's the only time in American history where we tried to fight an extended war without a draft army, with entirely a volunteer force, which means it's the same people over and over. A lot of people fought, but a lot of the same people fought. There was a Ranger non-commissioned officer who was killed 2 summers ago, who I'd known, who was killed. He had enlisted right at 9/11. He had had 14 tours. Now, Ranger tours are 3 and 4 months long, so it's not years. But his whole career had been at war. He got married, had 2 kids, and then he was killed on his 14th tour. So that's who's out there. And that's different from any time in history. And so it's a different dynamic. But fortunately, the people of the United States, whether you felt you supported the war politically or not, we were able to separate that from your feeling about the military, and that's very appreciated. The force could never have continued to do what it has done had that not been the case. That sense of support and the sense of inclusion into society was the determinant.
And let me, if I may, narrow it down now to the Special Forces, because I know that when you first entered the Rangers, they talked about the Special Forces guys outside as speckled feces, which is about as insulting as it gets. And yet today, the Special Forces can do no wrong. How did that transformation come about?
American military, like much of American society, doesn't like elitism. And so what happens is, usually with each war, we found elite units. We form them because there's a requirement for them. And then as soon as the war is nearing an end, we get rid of them because there's an antibody, the rejection of the idea of it. So during the Second World War, we formed the Rangers. We formed the 1st Special Force or Service Force. As soon as the war was over, got rid of them. During the Korean War, we formed the Rangers again in a slightly different form. We formed Special Forces. As soon as the Korean War was over, we got rid of the Rangers again. We kept Special Forces, but in a smaller thing. Then we went to Vietnam. We grew them both again, brought the Rangers back, grew Special Forces. As soon as the war got over, we did the same thing again. And when I entered Special Forces as a young officer I was in the 82nd First in 1977, I decided I wanted to go be a Green Beret because I'd seen the movie. And as I tell people, why didn't I go see Wall Street? I didn't like them not there. But I became a Green Beret, and that's, as I started to go, I went and volunteered for it, and guys started saying, sir, you're going to Speckle Feces. And I said, well, and they thought it was a place where people went if they were lazy and whatnot. But, and Special Forces was struggling in the late 70s, but it started to get better and better. And then in the 80s, I went to the Rangers, and suddenly we started this rebirth of American Special Operating Forces, which is the Rangers, Delta Force, SEAL Team 6, the whole gamut of it. It's great because we've developed this incredible group of professionals. The danger is, and you didn't ask me this question, but the danger is you start to think they're the tool for every job. And because they seem sexy and they seem, there's a temptation to want to solve it with that, and they're going to be very incorrect, improper for many things.
Yeah, I was actually going to push it further. When we see movies like Zero Dark 30, and I understand that it's stuck to the facts to a certain extent, but the impression is our special forces can go in, solve any problem, and extract without loss of life to the American side. I'm concerned that that gives perhaps civilians a sense that we can do anything we want with no loss to American lives in combat. And of course, that's not really the case.
Yeah, there are two dangers with that, and you hit the first one perfectly, Terry, and that is, and when I was doing this, people would say, we want to consider an operation, they'd ask you, what's the level of risk? And we'd assess it, and we'd come back and we'd say, it's high risk. But it got to where decision makers got very used to success, so they started almost to forget that. It's like your investment advisor says, you can invest in this and get this rate of return, and it's high risk. Well, you hear the rate of return and you think, well, the risk, I've never lost money before, so it's going to be okay. But the reality is it's high risk. And high risk not just of loss of life, but also of mission failure, which has national consequences. So that's one problem. And it's very dangerous stuff. And our special operating forces are so stunningly good right now. I mean, they are. That compared to anybody in the world, there's no comparison. And compared to anything before, there's no comparison. But that doesn't mean they can do any and everything. We fought against al-Qaeda in Iraq. I have told some people this. At one point, for more than 2 years, we did 300 raids a month, just my force, in Iraq alone. That's 10 a night. Most operators were on 4-month rotations, 120 days, and they would go for 4 months, they'd come back home for 8, and then they'd come for 4. On the 120 days, they'd do 120 raids every night. And when I talk raids, I'm not talking about patrols. I'm talking about somebody's going in the door and somebody's getting shot. And yet, we had this so good that we got almost overconfident that we always won the firefight. And so that's part of it that's a danger. The other part, however, is you have a movie like Zero Dark 30 and you see what went, and it was great. And actually, the depiction of the raid there was extraordinarily accurate to what a raid looks and feels like. But the danger is, the real story of Zero Dark 30, probably we ought to begin it at the raid, because look at all the ramifications of that with our relations to Pakistan and all. So anything we do that's a military action, we have to realize has a cost to it, a reaction to it. And so just because it's small and feels surgical doesn't mean it doesn't carry the same level of an act of war. And so it's just part of the calculation that the nation has to do.
I'd like to approach the Rolling Stone article issue because it's out there. 2010, they come out with a story and you read it at 2 o'clock in the morning, I believe, and then you went for a run. And then you had to fly back to Washington, and you resigned. How did you see that from your perspective? It was in the press. We read it all in the media. But for you, this was your career. How did you feel that that was handled and how you treated it and how you were treated?
Yeah. First off, for the background, everybody, there was the year that I commanded in Afghanistan, the war was not very popular. And so one of the things that we had to do was get support for the war. Had to get it with our European allies, had to get it with the Afghan people, had to get it with press, had to get it with the American population. So we had to do a lot of things. I did a 60-minute story that I didn't want to do, but came out okay. And then we had a lot of press through, and I did a number of embeds. And an embed doesn't mean the person's with you all the time. It means they come in for a couple of days, you don't see them for a couple of weeks, then they come back for a day or two and whatnot. And this was one of them. And they came to me and they said, how about having a guy from Rolling Stone? And I said, why would I do that? And they said, well, we got to get a different part of the American readership, see what you do. And I said, well, we're pretty transparent what we do, so all right. So we brought this guy around. And he was in and out for about 6 weeks. He was with us 2 or 3 times. And so I asked about it about 2 weeks before the article came out. I said, is that article ever coming out? And they said, yeah, he's working it, whatever. And then I got woken up about 2 in the morning, and they said, my exec woke me up, said, we got to talk, we got a problem. I said, what? And he said, the Rolling Stone article came out. And I said, really? That's going to be a puff piece. I mean, he's around the command group. He says, it's not. All right, so I went downstairs, and I lived right above our operations center. And he shows me the article, and as soon as I read the article, I knew what was happening here. The title of the article was A Runaway General, which you start with that. And then the article basically paints my command team as a sort of out-of-control group, attributes to us a bunch of comments about leaders and whatnot, that sort of thing, the vice president and whatnot. And as soon as I read it, I said, all right, this is going to cause a conflagration. Because we live in that world right now. We live in, look what General Shinseki's going through right now. What happens is we rush to the conflagration faster than we can investigate the reality of it. And so this was a pretty tense political time, and I knew there was this perception of civil-military issue. So this article came out, and as soon as I read it, I said, all right, well, it's going to be impossible to deal with this in a way where I can go, now, let me investigate it, let me figure out what's true and what isn't true. And I didn't know. Didn't know what in the article was accurate and what not. I knew that the overall depiction was not correct because I knew my team. But I didn't know on the facts. So I made a couple of calls. I called the Secretary of Defense, the chairman, obviously. And, but I sort of knew what the deal was. So I went out running, I came back, and I actually thought a couple of times, I said, I'm asleep, this is a dream, and I'm going to wake up. Because my whole life I thought I might be fired for incompetence or I might be killed. Those were pretty realistic possibilities that I thought a lot about, but I never thought I'd be accused of disloyalty. Never in a million years. And so when this thing comes, it was an out-of-body experience. But so the morning comes, and that was, it got to be daylight in the morning, and we're starting to deal with things. And I got a call from the chairman that says, okay, we're going to want you to fly back to the States later today and meet with the Secretary of Defense, the President. It's okay, fine. And as I did that whole process, I was able to think about it. Now, it was blowing up in the press over here. I couldn't see that, but I had a sense of that. There are really 2 real options there. One is to say, no, I don't think it's true. I think we've got to fight this. I want my day in court. But you got a war to fight. You got 150,000 guys who got to follow you, and you think about what's that situation then. And then the other option is to say, all right, whether or not I think the article's correct, what I have done is allowed myself to be in a position that puts the president in a tough position, and that's not I'm not supposed to do that. Whether I think it's fair or not, it's certainly not fair for the president to suddenly find himself pressured by this. So I made the decision that I would go in and tell the president that I would stay if he wanted me to, or offer my resignation if he wanted that, which is exactly what I did. And I never really had a second thought. I mean, obviously I've thought about it. I've replayed this in my mind a million times since then, but I don't have any doubts that what I did in terms of offering my resignation was right, because the most important thing at that time was a mission. And what you didn't need was a controversy between a general and the president being on the front page and that sort of thing. And, you know, the hardest part of it, and I don't know if any of you all have ever been there, everybody says, well, you know, I'd like publicity. Maybe you would, maybe you wouldn't. Is because, particularly if you think it's not fair, there's really not a venue to say that. That's not an option. And you got my 85-year-old father reading this, got my son off at college reading this, got my wife reading this. That's what you think about. You think about that and you say, look what I've just positioned that you are in now, that I feel responsible for. So, you know, that's the way it works. How do I feel about it now? Kind of like I got hit by lightning. I sort of feel like, you know, it's just one of those things that happens. It comes around and, you know, a number of things line up and poof, this thing happens to you and you really can't stop it and you can't cry about it. There's no point in it. You decide you're going to move forward. And so from that day on in your life, you can either replay that forever, you can argue that forever, you can try to say that wasn't right, or you can live moving forward and say what I'm going to do is conduct myself so that everybody who meets me says, wait a minute, I read that story and I met this guy and they are not congruent. And then let each person make their choice. And that's what I do.
Let me just add a coda to that story, because not a lot of people followed this, but in April of the following year, in 2011, the Department of Defense's Inspector General's office finished their review of this whole affair, because it was a serious affair and there were allegations that the office of the president had been impugned. They found no violations of DoD standards, and they also said, and I'll quote, "Not all the events occurred as portrayed in the article." I leave it up to you to make your judgments. But that leads me on to leadership lessons, because that was, in a sense, also a lesson in leadership. And that seems to be a theme that runs through your career. This search for leadership, mastery of leadership, exercising leadership. I'm curious about leadership in the midst of rapid change, because that is what war is about. Things are changing all the time and not always the way you want them to. It's easier, I think, if you're in a measured environment and you know what's going to happen and say, well, if I change this up. But when you're in a war, you're not in control of everything. Leadership there becomes paramount, but how do you practice for that?
Yeah, that's a really great question, because I've spent the last few years studying that. I spent the first years of my career experiencing it and try to deal with it sort of intuitively, and now I've been studying it. And I can think about it this way. If you think about something that's fairly organized that you know, think about the game of chess, about 6,000 years old, got understood rules. Each side has 16 players. Each of the pieces has a unique capability in how it moves, a set of power. And there's a version of chess called blitz chess, and that is very rapid clock movement, so you have to move. And you think, well, that's really hard. But then you think about it, all the pieces move in a set way, and even if you're moving fast, it's iterative. You make a move, and then your opponent makes a move. You make a move, and then your opponent makes a move. And no matter how fast it is, that doesn't even begin to capture the complexity in which we're living in an environment now, whether it's business or government or war. Because in reality, there are no such rules. First off, the pieces are not predictable in how they can move. And the second, it's not iterative. You don't make a move and then your opponent makes a move. In fact, your opponent can make 4 moves simultaneously, and if you don't move quick enough, they can move 4 more again. And if you make 1, they can do 6. Or you're not playing against one opponent. In fact, you're playing against, imagine if all the chess pieces on the side against you aren't controlled by one person, but in fact, they all have a mind of their own. They're seeing it from their level. They got their own brains, and they're dealing with it. And so suddenly they are this thinking, learning entity at a factor much faster than you are, and you're trying to go through this process. Now, wait a minute, I got to think back to what the strategy of chess is, and suddenly you find yourself in this reactive mode where the speed and complexity has grown so fast that you just sort of want the merry-go-round to stop so I can get back to my strategy. That's the way war has gotten. It has become disorientingly fast, and simultaneously it's become interconnected, meaning before you might have a war that took place in a certain place, and although it was connected in some ways to other parts of the battlefield or other parts of the world, that was a very delayed process. Now it's connected through information technology instantaneously. If you think about the fruit seller who burned himself to death in Tunisia, December 17th, 2010, here's a fruit seller, Mohammed Bouazizi, kills himself because he's angry with the government. Had good reason. January 11th, the government fell. That's barely 3 weeks later. The government fell because one guy killed himself, but it went viral. January 18th, 2011, just another week from that, a video blog was put out in Egypt that said, come to Tahrir Square on the 25th for a rally. On the 25th, over 1 million people showed up. February 11th, after 40 years in power, Mubarak's out. They didn't know what hit him. I mean, the Egyptian government, which was pretty good at population control for a long time, they didn't know what hit them. And that's the way things are now. It is at a point where the master leader, the master strategist, can't do it. Nobody is capable of doing it. So it's upended how we have to run organizations. And what we did in Joint Special Operations Command is we didn't study this and realize it. We realized it through trial and error. And we upended the way we operated so that we decentralized our execution and the authority to make decisions way down so that they could decide really by themselves. But at the same time, we centralized information so that everybody had to tell everybody everything all the time. So this became this learning organization. But the leader's role changed fundamentally in that I didn't make a lot of decision. My decision was to create the venue, stimulate the constant conversation. As I say, I used to walk around and say, I'd spin the pie plates like the old, on the sticks on the old Ed Sullivan show. I just keep it going and the organization does the work. But it's fundamental change for the leader because you don't have that same feeling like I am the man, I make the decisions, I am Napoleon making the critical moves at a time. I'm the chess master. You're not. You create the chessboard, you set the rules, and you enable your pieces to do it. Long answer, but I'm fascinated by that question.
Bob asked me to ask you about drones. Immensely useful military tools, both for observation and for delivering weapon systems, but do create pushback, as we've seen in Pakistan and more recently in Yemen. I'm wondering, do we need a new rule book to govern the use of drones? Because there's never really been anything like them before. How do you see that developing in our military?
No, it's a good one. There have been a bunch of times in history where the rules have sort of changed. It used to be bad form to kill officers on the battlefield, particularly to shoot officers. I thought that was a great rule, but it got changed. And that sort of changed the values or the mores, the unwritten rules of the game. And what has happened with drones is they're a technological leap that changed some of the calculus. Missiles did it first, things like Tomahawks, but drones brought it home because we could put so many up. And what it allowed you to do, it allowed you to look at things you couldn't look at before and shoot things you couldn't shoot at before with zero risk to yourself physically. So you could put this thing up, you could drone it over them, whatever you want, and you could shoot whenever you want. And if they shot it down, or so what? Just get another one. They're not even very expensive. Well, it's great. And to be honest, drones are going to become common in everything. Not everybody in this room, but some of the young people in this room will fly on unmanned passenger jets in your life. Guarantee it. Just a generational thing. As soon as the old people get over it, the young people are going to do it. But here's the challenge with drones. If we go back to 1988, when President Clinton You remember he did a strike against Al-Qaeda because of the threats to President Bush, H.W. Bush. He shot Tomahawk missiles into the Sudan and into Pakistan, or Afghanistan. One went into Pakistan when it shouldn't have, but the rest went into Pakistan, or Afghanistan. If you'd asked most American the next morning whether we were at war, none of us would have said we were at war. We said, no, we're not at war. We shot some Tomahawk missiles last night, but we're not at war. But if you'd asked the people at the receiving end of the Tomahawk missiles if they were at war with the U.S., different answer. And so the answer is we've lowered the threshold for ability to do what is really an act of war. We can watch them, violate their sovereignty to watch them, and we can shoot them. And because we haven't put ourselves at risk, we sort of say, well, this isn't war, this is just what we do. So the danger is if you lower the threshold for that kind of operation, you may take it less seriously than it is. And you may underestimate the reaction from the people who are receiving it, and even more the actions or the reaction of the people who see it. In Pakistan, we're hated, and our drone operations are hated, but they are more hated in the Punjab than they are in Waziristan, where the drone strikes have gone. Because the people in the Waziristan don't love them, but they know why you're shooting, and they know who you're shooting, and they sort of get it. The people in the rest of the country just see it as a violation of sovereignty, and this is wrong. People in the rest of the world, to a great degree, view it the same way. I sometimes ask people, what if Mexico came into the U.S. and in Texas shot a drone and killed a drug dealer? I don't think we'd say, hey, good on you. I think we'd feel that wasn't right. So I am an advocate of the use of drones, but what I'd say is we need I don't know if a rule book's going to do it, but a cultural appreciation for this. Every time you do something, it has a value and it has a cost. And sometimes we can do a better job of appreciating the perception of people at the other side of this thing, and then do your calculus on whether it's worth it. And because they've got this special aura around them now, we need to admit that. Drones have a special effect. So if you kill somebody with a drone, it seems a little more offensive to some people than it does if they're killed another way. And we just need to appreciate that. I mean, it's war and everything is about a perception.
We'll get some questions on the floor, but let me ask one more, because I know it involves something you're quite passionate about. This Saturday is Armed Forces Day. I don't know how many people here know that. Third Saturday in May has been since 1949. We don't have a draft. A lot of people are not connected anymore. You are in favor not just of a draft, but something even more comprehensive. National service. Explain the thought behind it and where you're at.
Yeah, thanks for asking about that, Terry. I am, and here's why. If we go back to the Second World War, 16 million Americans in uniform, but every family touched by it in some way. People working, people sacrificing, whatnot. And then we think about the term that Tom Brokaw said so well, the greatest generation. And we got part of the greatest generation in here. But my belief is the greatest generation was not the fact that they won the Second World War or survived the Depression or whatever. That was great. But that's what made them the greatest generation. It's what they did with that experience and with the values that were inculcated in them from that, the sense of citizenship. I think what we've done is we've let the concept of citizenship deteriorate a bit. I think people are starting to feel that citizenship is paying taxes, it's voting, and I've done my share. But in reality, citizenship is this wider responsibility. Think of the times in parts of the nation where you couldn't raise your barn without help because you couldn't physically do it. Think about militias on the frontier. You had to be a community to do things. We've let that deteriorate, and so as a consequence, we don't know each other in communities, inside communities, and we're segmented in communities, and the sense of who's a citizen and what that means isn't as strong as it used to be. So my belief is a way we can help fix this is to give every young American between 18 and 28 the opportunity and the implied responsibility to do a year of paid national service, full-time for 12 months, health care, conservation, education, some range, could be military if they want, but you don't need everybody in the military, something that takes them out of their comfort zone and they go do something. They get a living stipend, 12 to 15,000 bucks, not enough to get rich, but enough to keep you in food and whatnot. Serve with people from around the country. And at the end of that year, the product is not the work they do, although the work must be of value. The product is them. The product is different citizens. And they may not be a better citizen today, but they will be.
We have two microphones, one here and one here. If you put your hand up, we'll get to you. Jessica, can you go? Thank you. Then we got another microphone over here. And we have to get the general out of here before 9 o'clock, or those Navy SEALs are coming in the roof, so
okay, so
keep them short.
General, thank you so much for coming to Los Angeles and helping us understand some of the more subtle effects of what you've been through. I was chatting with a fellow who was just in Iraq a little while back, and he said that it was just a terrible mess, and said that he didn't think that had American military forces stayed there, that they would have been able to prevent some of this take back that Al-Qaeda and the Sunnis have done. Can you address that question?
Yes, ma'am. And if you couldn't hear, the answer is really, would Iraq be where it is now, which is a real problem state, if American forces had staged? And this is my personal opinion, but I agree with that. We really, in 2005 to about 2008, we wrestled Al-Qaeda down to the ground, and we beat them up and essentially took them out of the fight. What has happened since then, in my view, and I think America stepped away too quickly. I think we should and could have worked through the status of forces agreement. But we've allowed Iraq to give way to some of its baser instincts. The government, Prime Minister Maliki, has done a lousy job of convincing the Sunnis and the Kurds that they are a part of this nation. And so as a consequence, the Sunnis particularly are frightened, and they're irritated, and they are tender for people like Al-Qaeda in Iraq, now ISIS, to raise up again. And so as a consequence, they're starting a pretty serious fight again. Fallujah was occupied. And the thing about war is, once you start a war, you could start a war for one reason, and then pretty soon it continues for its own reason. Because you start it for political reasons and you got certain end states, but once you've killed each other, then you fight because you killed my brother, you killed my family, etc. And so the conflagration doesn't have to have tremendous logic after that, because it has passion. And then the problem in Iraq is made worse by the fact that there's a perception of Iranian control of the Shia-dominated government. But even worse, across the border in Syria now, you have this open sore, this bleeding ulcer of Syria, which has in parts of the opposition is a pretty fundamentalist group. So now the Sunnis in Iraq get at least support from what's happening in Syria, which just makes it worse. So I think we made a mistake there, and I don't think we're going to go back and correct it, but I think we're going to live with it for a while.
General McChrystal, your concept of a national service, is that compulsory or is it voluntary? And if it is compulsory, has there been pushback from civil libertarian groups?
Yeah. The answer is, it is not compulsory. When I first voiced the idea, it was. And I'll be honest, when I get at night by myself and do the things you don't talk about, I dream of compulsory national service. But smarter people said, no, we got to make it voluntary. So what we're trying to do is make it voluntary, but expected. So we're working with businesses and colleges and whatnot to get preferential hiring, preferential admission, credit for it afterward, a GI Bill-like support. So we're trying to make it in every young person's best interest to do it because they get advantages from it. So we're not asking them to do it just for altruism. I didn't enter the Army to serve the nation. Most people don't. They enter because it looks like it's going to be fun and it's an adventure. Then when you're there, you get the bug. And that's, I think, the key to this. Thank you.
I don't wish to sound patronizing, but in light of your comments about the article, I have a feeling that you should feel vindicated based upon what is happening currently.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of, yeah. You know, I sort of feel like life goes on, and I was given the gift of a painful experience, and if I'm not smart enough to try to grow with it, then I miss that opportunity. So that's what I try to do. And so I don't really take any great solace in anybody having any other problems. You know, the individual who wrote the story was killed in a car accident. Right here? Yeah, right here. They told me, I was given a speech. I walked off the stage, and a reporter was waiting for me and told me that. And he says, and he was an old friend of mine. He says, how do you feel? And I said, how can I feel? A human being died who, you know, I take no pleasure in that. So I guess I take more pleasure in just trying to move forward. But you're kind, sir. Thank you.
Would you comment on the Wounded Warrior Project? Bill O'Reilly and others have done a lot for this project. Why is there a need for a Wounded Warrior Project with payments from citizens? Isn't this a responsibility of the federal government?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not going to talk about the Wounded Warrior Project. That is one of the that's one of the big ones, but there are a whole bunch of them, so I'm going to lump them all together. Actually, the government does a pretty good job. On the medical part, I think they do a great job. The problem is the government isn't good when somebody is ready to leave the hospital and go back to their community. The government isn't good at that and is never going to be too good at that. You really don't want them to be too good at that because you don't want the government to control everything at the local level. I think what we have to do, and I actually think it's useful to have things like for wounded warriors and families and whatnot, because it brings America back into a sense of, you know, young people go to war from our communities. They're not created in some lab or test tube and made into soldiers. They come from your houses, your streets, your towns, and you send them over. You vote, you pay taxes, you send them, they fight for you. When you come home, when they come home, they belong to you, not to the government. And so I actually think it's very good that we have the requirement because it forces Americans to do it. Now, I will say there are some needs I think could be better met, and I hate the fact that, you know, we have some veterans and families who go through a lot of bureaucracy and whatnot. We ought to automatically do that. We shouldn't just be relying on generosity, but I do like the idea that it forces Americans to be involved. Here's a statistic. During the Civil War, 1 out of every 68 Americans was wounded. So you knew somebody who was wounded. You saw them in your town or in your street or in your family. About 2 years ago, last time I checked, it was 1 out of every 7,260 Americans is wounded. You don't even know someone who's been wounded, most likely, particularly if you live in a lot of areas. So having that connection, I think, has some value. Great point, sir. Thank you.
Okay. Sir, there are, I have to preface this, I'm a former naval officer, and I served many years, and what I'm finding today is, as we speak about the Wounded Warrior Project and so forth, how do you feel down the road, because now that you're out, and I'm finding this as a tremendous impact, women who have served, and I don't mean to sound sexist, but this has to come off that way, because what I'm finding is that the services are leaning more toward, it's all about the men, but we forget about the women who've served. And we've served combat, we've served administratively, I served for 3 admirals, and I can honestly tell you, we work equally as hard, but we somehow do not receive that kind of recognition. So how do you feel about that?
Yeah, well, I agree with you. The services, no matter how hard we try at a lot of things, reflect American values, and because the services, by the nature of what they are, conservative institutions, not politically, but culturally, don't change as fast as we hope they will. They change pretty well, but they don't change. So female service members have a tougher row to hoe. Typically, female officers will be put in assignments that they're good, but they're not the path to being senior leaders. It's much harder to become a senior leader as a female because the same opportunities aren't open to you. I think, we had this big argument about whether women can be in combat. Sort of after the fact, they've been in combat for the last 15 years. And I watched them. I've watched them get wounded. I've watched them fight. I've watched them do all of those things. And it's time we go on and just admit that. Part of that's the services problem. Part of that is just our society. It's just, we're slower to reflect things than we probably ought to be. I think inside the services, most service members, maybe slow to it, will admit that. But it takes a while. I was at West Point the last year when it was all male. And then right after I graduated, that first female entered. And I remember all these old grads and all said, West Point will fall into the Hudson River. It will just go to the dogs. And I mean, they did all these things that just won't be the same. And I didn't have much of an opinion because I was about to leave. But it didn't. It just kind of did fine. But it takes a little time. And I know that's tough on social change, but it's borne out by experience. So thank you. Thanks for your service.
Hi, I have a question. Speaking to some of my friends who serve, they've noticed that since 9/11, there's a whole generation of soldiers who have more combat experience than really anyone has had for many generations in our country, and they're being led at the top by people who don't have nearly as much experience. I'm curious what challenges that presented for you when you led men, and how you think that's affecting the military now.
Yeah, it's an interesting challenge because the early years of my career, when we were all kind of hoping to go to war to get experience, we didn't. And then I spent a decade at war as a general, but my experience was therefore different. And I had sergeants and lieutenants and captains who knew things and had experience I didn't have. And so I couldn't go down to them and put my arm around them and say, this is how you do this in combat, because I hadn't had that experience. And so the first thing you have to do is you have to get over it. You have to apply what we call reverse mentoring. You got to ask them what works, but then you got to understand you still have a role. And so while that's very true, we also now have a lot of senior leaders who also have been shot at a lot as well. So it's probably not as bad as you think, but it's always going to be an issue because technology and experience changes so fast that the war, even if I had fought when I was a young man, the experience I had wouldn't have been nearly as relevant as it might have been 100 years ago where change wasn't as fast. So it's got to be a different kind of leadership. It's much more collaborative than it is directive now. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. You talked about the greatest generation, and maybe there's a new greatest generation, but what's happening is although Americans seem to really respect and admire people in the military, there's this narrative going on about wounded warriors and people who can't really handle the stress. And as a result, I was talking to a Army captain the other day, and he said he applied to 5 coffee shops for a job, and he's a pretty intelligent guy, and he was rejected by all of them. He's been to HR departments and said, can you really handle this? And so what's happening, it seems, is that the narrative, what the media is putting out there is a very different one, and as a result, it's having all of these negative effects. How would you address something like that?
Yeah, and really what he's talking about is post-traumatic stress syndrome. It started, people said, well, it's real. And it is real. Anybody who's been in combat comes back different. But it doesn't mean you come back damaged. It doesn't mean you come back deranged. It doesn't mean you come back anything. You just come back different. And some people, it's very hard on, but the vast majority come out just fine, and they come out stronger. But because we're trying to take care of people, we haven't communicated that as well as we could. And so quite naturally, there are some people, business and other people who go, wow, I don't know if I should bring that person in because they might, they might have issues, they might get violent, et cetera. When in reality, there's not a track record statistically that says that's going to happen, but I know that there's a perception. And I think we've got to balance our well-intended reporting of this, I think has produced some negative effects. So I think we got to step back and we got to see this for what it really is. Most people who come back better because they've had experiences, more mature, they've been tested and whatnot. And so I think your point's exactly right. Thank you.
Time for just one more question.
I think we'd all like to know what you're doing now.
Yeah, it's funny. When I got out of the service, I didn't know what I wanted to do because I had not expected to get out then and that way. I got a call from a guy who asked if I'd come teach at Yale, and I'd never even been there. So I said, sure. So I've just finished my 4th year at Yale, and I'm going to stay there. And I'm going to stay until at least we beat Harvard. But I'm writing a second book, and it'll be out, in the late fall, early January period, about leadership and about management and about these things. Not military, it's about kind of what I've thought about it since then, and I'm really excited about that. And then I started a company with some Navy SEALs, which is exciting. And then we got a bunch of young people, and what we do is we work with civilian companies on how to change your culture. We don't work with defense, we don't work with the government at all. We go to companies and we say, the environment that we described about the speed and whatnot, we help the companies try to deal with that. And it's been fascinating because the reality is leadership in a corporation in the military is so similar, it's shocking. The only thing I'll finish with, when you're in the military, you think civilian companies are very different. And so when you just get military guys together, at some point in the conversation, somebody will wrap the table and go, we're all screwed up. If we were a civilian company, we'd never put up with the inefficiency and stupidity we do. I got out and I started working with civilian companies. In every meeting, at some point, somebody wraps the table, looks at me and says, the military would never be this stupid, would they? I say no. Thanks so much.
General, thank you very much.